Welcome back to the shop, everyone. This week's video takes place in 2023, week 23, June 5th to June 11th. And we're going to start this out by working on this timing cover. This is a new to me timing cover, so what we're going to do is we're just going to start off by getting it all cleaned up, remove any of the old gasket material, any dirt or anything like that, and get it prepped for reinstallation. What I also need to do is scrape off all of the old gasket material from the block. I really should have done this before I put it all back together, just because you really don't want any contaminants in a freshly put back together engine. But if you're careful enough and stupid enough like me, you can do this afterwards. But yeah, if you're doing something like this in the future, just save yourself the hassle while the block is all apart. You don't care about it getting dirty. Clean off all the gasket material, and yeah. So yeah, right there I'm just looking at the timing chain play, and it should probably be a lot tighter than that. This is a used engine. If I cared about longevity in this engine, I would buy a new timing roller set, but I don't, so I didn't. So I just grabbed the timing cover bolt set down from the shelf, and what I'm doing is I'm pulling out the old front seal. So that's what the oil pan will actually seal to on the timing cover, is that little area right there. So it looks like the previous installer glued it in, so I'm just cleaning up the mating surface, getting all the glue out of it, getting any remnants of seal out of it, and just making it so it's perfectly clean. So long as the seal's doing its job, you really shouldn't need to add any additional glue or anything like that. Even with the gaskets, you really only need to add maybe just a tiny little bit like I'm doing here in the corners. And the only reason why I'm doing that is because there's a bit of a cavity underneath the ends of it. So I just wanted to add a little bit just to make sure it seals in the corner. But as far as gluing it down to the actual timing cover, yeah, I don't think that's needed. So what I'm doing here is there's actually a little groove in the timing cover that the seal sits in, so I'm just using a screwdriver and very carefully, as to not damage the seal, pushing it down into the groove. With that seal installed, I'm just going to take a little bit of WD-40, just kind of clean up the front cover, clean off any little bits that might be there with the razor blade, clean up the inside, and then it's pretty much ready to go. So I read all the Felpro instructions, which is who makes this gasket, and they said, you know, you don't need to use any sort of adhesive or sealant or anything like that. The gasket should be sufficient to just seal itself. So that's my plan. I am not going to put any sealant or any sort of anything on this. I'm just simply going to gasket or metal to gasket to metal on the other side, and that's going to be that. What I'm doing here is there is a dowel pin for aligning the timing cover to the block. And so I'm just punching it out of the timing cover because it was in there pretty good. So this right here is where it goes in the block, and so what that's going to do is when you put the timing cover on, it just aligns it all. There is a dowel pin in the other timing cover, but it was stuck in there, so I opted not to put it on. I was like, well, I got one, it should be good enough. So now I'm just going to start quickly cleaning up all of the timing cover mounting hardware. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 bolts. And then I'm just going to throw a little tiny bit of RTV sealer right at the very bottom of the gasket. If I recall correctly, that may have been in the instructions, or I may have just added that for no reason. But yeah, so before I put all the hardware in, I want to tap out all of the holes in the block, just to try and get any crap out of it. If there's any sort of dirt or debris or anything in the hole, it'll mess with your torque reading. So it's best to just clean it out as best as you can. So just kind of showing you just how much gunk there is in there, and there is a fair amount. And with a clean tap, it's a good thing I cleaned this all out. I forget what the torque spec are on these, but you can look them up if you really if you need to. So in order to put the timing cover on, I need to pull the bolt out of the crankshaft, and then I can slide the timing cover on. Make sure that I'm just going to use a bolt here to make sure that the gasket kind of stays in place. It'll go on the dowel pin. Those bolt holes will get started, and then the timing cover just slides on. So I wasn't able to get the torque wrench onto the top 2 bolts, so those are just going hand tight, and the rest will get torqued. There's really nothing else you can do. with everything torqued and tightened down, I'm just going to cut off some of the excess gasket. It's just not needed for this application. If I was building an engine that I really wanted to be, I really cared about, I wanted to be showy, what I would have done is I would have taken the gasket, put it onto the timing cover with the dowel pins, traced it all out, and cut it to fit exactly on the timing cover. But for this, I just didn't really care. I just wanted it together. So what I'm doing here is on the harmonic balancer, there's what's called timing marks. So when the engine's running, you can see how far advanced or retarded the timing is. So I could never see the timing marks on this old balancer, so I took a little green roll-lock disc and cleaned it all up. And what I'm trying to do is put some paint down into the timing marks themselves, and then let it dry, and then just clean up the top of it. But it didn't really work out that well. After the paint dried, what happened was I tried using that the green disc on the die grinder, and it kind of went down into all the timing marks and removed all the paint. So I tried it again with sandpaper, and it just didn't work. So I just gave up. I didn't care that much. So what I ended up doing is I just cleaned it all out so you could actually see all the numbers, and we called that good. What I'm doing here is I am prepping the block for the head to be installed. So there's 4 dowel pins, 4 dowel pins, 2 on the bottom of each corner of the head, and that just locates the head on the block. Kind of like the dowel pins in the timing cover locate the timing cover to the front of the block. Those 2 dowel pins at the bottom of the engine block locate the heads properly on the engine block. So you can see I'm using some sandpaper just to try and get the timing mark numbers to have some color. It didn't work out so well, so I just said screw it, clean it all up, and who cares. What I'm doing is I'm just grabbing a bucket, I'm cleaning it out, and I'm going to throw some mineral spirits in this bucket, and that's so I can clean off all the head bolts. All of the fasteners it feels like they're coated with almost like a oil or a coating of some sort, and so they don't rust up while they're just being stored. So a little bit of mineral spirits, toss the bolts in there, and clean them all up. So just loosely putting the harmonic balancer on, and what I'm doing is I'm rotating the engine to number 1 top dead center, and I'm checking the timing mark on the balancer to see if it actually lines up, and it does. So balancer is installed correctly, the timing mark is correct, and number 1 is that top dead center. So I now know that the camshaft is in time with the crank. The crank top dead center is accurate, so when I put the heads on, if I roll the engine over at all, I'll be able to easily find where number 1 top dead center is, because the balancer is correct. So before we get those heads installed, we are going to do a little bit of cleanup. So not only did we need to clean up the shop, we also need to clean up these new to me heads. So these still have the exhaust gaskets on. There's a bunch of remnants from the head gasket. So I have to do the same thing to these heads that I did to my last set, which is take a scraper, clean all of the all the gasket material off, et cetera, et cetera. So you've already seen this process, but you get to see it again because I fucked up my first set of heads, and this is just part of it. You know, you mess something up, and generally you got to redo it. Since the cleanup job is fairly messy, I am just going to throw a garbage bag over the engine to make sure that, you know, none of the bits as I'm cleaning off, you know, jump over and get into it. Alright, so now that I've cleaned up my second set of heads, it is time to clean up that massive mess on the floor. With that mess all cleaned up, let's get the block uncovered and let's just start cleaning the bores. We'll clean the surface again, just kind of go over it, make sure it's got no contaminants, and we will pull out our first head gasket and we will start reading the instructions and reading all up about it and see what it says and all that good stuff. It's kind of difficult to see here, but it does say front on it, so you always want to make sure that the front of the head gasket is to the front of the engine, especially on these Fords. There's oil coolant passages that I believe are blocked off on the front but open in the back. So yeah, you can see right there at the back of the head gasket there's two holes kind of in the middle of the gasket, whereas the front it's just completely blocked off. If you put this head gasket on backwards, what you can do, what's going to happen is the water is just going to go from the front of the engine up into the heads. It's not going to be forced all the way to the back of the engine, up into the back, all the way to the front, and then out. So that would be a really bad thing. So make sure you got your head gaskets on the right way. And what I also did is I also trimmed the top of the head gasket. It does say in the instructions, you can kind of see on the one that was in the package there's a little extra like lip. It says in the instructions, cut it flush. I don't know why it's not like that from the factory. Maybe some of the small blocks needed it. But in any case, in this case, I did trim it. So I'm just doing a little bit more cleanup on the heads before I actually put them on. You know, just run the air through it all, make sure there's no debris in it anywhere. And yeah, we can just sit it on the block. So those dowel pins make it super easy to locate and lets you just sit it on the block. So what I'm going to do now is I've thrown some mineral spirits in that bucket and I'm throwing all of the head bolts into there just to clean off the transportation coating, and we're gonna get them all laid out. And if I recall correctly, the long bolts go along the top of the head, the short bolts go along the bottom, and the short bolts all go into water jackets, so they require a sealant. Before I get started with that, I want to tap out all of the bolt holes that the head's going to bolt to. I want to try and make sure that the threads are clean, there's no junk in there, and that the bolts will get, you know, the best mating surface they can. So tapping all of these bolt holes out is a long and boring process, but it is something that you should do, just, you know, for peace of mind and just to make it easier on yourself. So I think I've prepped my block well enough now so I can start putting that head on. So those bolts have been sitting, so I'm going to pull them all out, dry them all off, and then I'm going to get them coated with the correct lubricants. So as I mentioned, those long head bolts go along the top of the head, and they do not require any sealant, but they do require the ARP installation lubricant, Molly. I don't know what it is, but they send you a pack of grease with the bolts, and you're supposed to put it on the threads of the long ones. I don't. Oh, that's right. There are washers. So you're supposed to throw some of the grease under the head of the washer. The washer has a little chamfer on it that goes towards the head of the washer. So the flat side is to the head. So long washers get the long bolts get the ARP grease under the washer as well as on the threads. The short bolts get the ARP grease under the washers, but they get a sealant on the threads because they go into a water jacket. So you need to make sure that you have a sealant on there so that no water gets by. And the stuff that ARP sends is not sufficient for water jacket installation. You need a separate sealer. Now that I have the ARP grease on all of the bolts that need it, I'm going to switch my glove, and I'm going to start putting the sealant on all of the short bolts that go into the water jackets. So right now I'm just kind of hand threading all the bolts in. As I mentioned, the long bolts go at the top or towards the center of the block, and then the short ones go on the outside of the block or the bottom, depending on how you look at it. I just thread them all in by hand, and then I grab a tool just to speed them in there, and then I torque them all down to the appropriate specifications. So I don't remember what I torqued these down to. I followed the specifications on the sheet. I know I did it in 3 equal steps following the pattern provided by the Felpro head gasket. As I say, I know it was in 3 equal steps, so I want to say it was like 22, 44, 65 or something along those lines, but don't quote me on that. Always read your directions, follow the instructions, because this could change. This set of bolts might have a different, this head gasket and the ARP bolts might have a different specification on the next batch. So always, even if you've done it 100 times, always read the directions, because the directions can change. Yeah, so I got the the passenger side head done. So that's cylinders 1 through 4. And now I am going to work on installing the driver side head, which is cylinders 5 through 8. So for some reason this time I opted not to trim the head gaskets ahead of time. Kind of ended up being a dumb idea, but you live and you learn. I'd trim it up ahead of time next time if I ever have to do this again. So I did take a few extra seconds looking at the head gaskets here, and that's only because on the passenger side, the gasket didn't have all of like the blue coloring towards the top, whereas on this one it did, so it was different. So I just took a second to double check and make sure that I put it on the right way, and I did. The front was at the front, top was top. And I kind of double checked, had I put this on the other side, the same thing would have happened. So I don't think I got these on wrong. But yeah, so I'm going to do the same thing, just get all the bolts in hand tight, and then I'm going to torque them down in 3 equal steps. So in my mind, I was like, oh, well, I can just trim the head gasket after it's installed. It'll be easy. I can just take my razor blade. But no, it's like a metal material, and it ended up, the razor blade wouldn't cut it. So I ended up taking a pair of side cutters to it. And yeah, I would just trim this ahead of time, next time probably. Alright, with the heads installed, I can turn my attention to cleaning up the shop a little bit. It's got a lot of a mess, a lot of tools out, so let's just get it cleaned up, get some of the crap off of the floor, and make it a more hospitable working environment. Alright, now that I have the shop cleaned up a little bit, I'm going to start cleaning up all of the top end components. So those are the push rods, the lifters, and the rockers. You know, the main reason for this teardown is I lit a bag on fire on top of the engine, and that plastic burned, and there was a lot of chunks inside, you know, inside the lifters, on the roll or on the push rods. So I'm doing my best to make sure I clean it out. Like in this case, in this lifter, there was a chunk of plastic stuck between the little the seat and the retaining ring. So I had to, you know, it took a long time to get that little chunk out of there. I think fortunately for me, this was the longest one. I was kind of not looking forward to them all being this bad. Unfortunately, they weren't. But you know, that's what is that? That's number 1, 2, 3, 4, number 8. I think that's the intake, and that would have been closest to the front of the engine, which is, you know, where the bag started on fire. So it kind of makes sense that was the worst one. But yeah, so I just go through, I sprayed it down with a little bit of WD-40. I use the air compressor, I blow out all the push rods, and I just give it a good general cleanup. So as I'm installing all of the components in the top end, you know, especially the lifters, I am giving them a good healthy dose of assembly lubricant, and that's because this engine is going to sit for a little while before it's fired up. I know I'm going to have to rotate it around a bunch to, do specific things. And so I just want to make sure there's as little metal on metal as possible. That assembly lubricant should hopefully protect it. And so as I'm doing things like indexing the bell housing and, a bunch of other stuff, hopefully it doesn't, destroy the cam, destroy the lifters, and, just generally be a bad time. So yeah, you can kind of see that some of the lifters are protruding from their holes, and that's because those specific cylinders would be in the middle of an intake or an exhaust event, whereas the other ones are kind of flat or just a little bit below the bore, and that's because they are riding on the base of the lobe, and neither of those intake or exhaust valves would be open. Now that we have all of the lifters installed, we can start installing the push rods. And so here we are installing the number 5 push rod on the exhaust. So it's just, pull up the lifter, put it in, and we're just going to do the same thing for all of them. Alright, so what I'm doing now is I'm moving all of the lifters and push rods loose, and I'm taking off just the number 1 intake, and what I'm doing is I'm putting Sharpie on the top of the intake valve. What I'm then going to do is I'm going to put that rocker back on, torque it down to spec. I'm going to roll the motor over a few times, and I'm going to check and see on that valve where the contact pattern is. Now, on these rockers, it's not like these are just, you know, stamped steel crappy rockers. It's not a roller rocker, so there isn't like a little roller bearing on the tip. If there was a little roller bearing on the tip, the contact pattern would be much smaller. But in any case, the contact pattern is in the middle of the valve, which is exactly where I want it. It means the push rod length is the right length. And so I'm checking that because these are different rockers, these are different heads. So if I needed to change the push rod because it was too far to the top or the bottom, then I'd be able to adjust. But all in all, everything worked just fine. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to torque down all of those rocker studs. If I recall correctly, they get torqued down to 25 foot-pounds, but again, I don't remember off the top of my head. I would have to go back and look it up. So what I'm doing is I am setting the lifter in question on the base of the lobe, so it's not lifting the valve at all, and then I torque it, and then what I do is on the inside of the block there, I'm just taking my Sharpie and making a little mark on the lifter to show that I've torqued it, and that way I make sure that I've actually torqued all 16 of them. I haven't forgotten any. On these, I don't think it's really critical to be on the base of the lobe because they just get torqued down to 25 foot-pounds, and it is what it is. But I did it anyways, just, you know, because I wanted to. Here we go. I'm writing down all of the torque specs. So the heads I did 32 or 23, 46, and then 70. And then, yeah, I think that said the rockers were 25 foot-pounds. So, yeah, that's the top end put together. You know, for the most part, other than putting oil pump and pan back on, this is kind of ready to go back in the car. So what I'm doing is there is some timing cover gasket material protruding from where the timing cover meets the block. So I'm just taking a razor blade and I'm just cutting a fresh razor blade, I should say, and just cutting that gasket material straight. And on the other side, I don't know if I show you here, but I took a picture from her Instagram, I think. The other side of the block, the timing cover, because I only did one dowel pin, the timing cover is not lined up correctly with the block. It's actually about 1/8 of an inch off. So what I'm doing here is I am loosening off all of the timing cover bolts, and then what I do is I just by feel get it realigned properly, and then I retorque all of the bolts. So yeah, I probably should have moved the camera a lot sooner just so you could see how off the timing cover was, but I got it moved and it's perfectly straight now. Alright, so next up we have the oil pump. So this is actually what supplies oil to the entire engine in this style of engine. 2 bolts holding it to the block, and then 2 bolts holding a pickup. So right now I am looking for a gasket. For some reason I thought that I had a gasket that goes between the oil pump and the block, but there doesn't end up being one. So I take a little bit of RTV sealant and just do the tiniest little skim of it along the surface just to seal any imperfections. I don't know if that's needed or if that might actually hurt in the long run, so I guess we'll see once we fire this up if I have good oil pressure or not. Yeah, so as I said, I couldn't find a gasket, so I'm just using a tiny bit of sealer. Not much at all, just enough to just a tiniest little skim on the block. So I just tighten the bolts down, and then I'm just going to spin the crank to make sure that the crank doesn't interfere with the pump, which there's no reason why it should, considering that's the crank and the pump that came off of the engine. So now I'm looking for the oil pump pickup tube. So this bolts to the oil pump. It's got a support bracket that goes to the number 3 main cap, and then that will pick up oil from the sump in the oil pan. So I'm just removing that sticker because I don't want any kind of things that might end up in the oil pan to be present. So I'm just cleaning off the surface where the pickup mounts to the pump. And again, there's no gasket for this, but for my own peace of mind, I'm just applying just the tiniest little bit of RTV sealant just to, maybe take up any imperfections. Again, I don't know if this is a good idea or not, but I did it. And right here, I'm about to drop that oil pump bolt right down between the timing cover and the timing chain. So this takes me a little while to get it out. I was really hoping I didn't have to pull the timing cover off to get it. And I don't. I was able to work it out with the magnet eventually, but it did take a while. So this does take a little while, but I did get it out, which is, that's a load off my shoulders. So I get the top bolt in, I get the bottom bolt in, and, you know, it's not really lining up. Like, I've got the bracket on the actual main cap, and then the bolt holes in the back just are not quite lining up the way I expect them to. So the solution is to come over to the vise, put the pickup tube in the vise, and just tweak it ever so slightly. I of course tweaked it just a little tiny bit too much, so I gotta go back to the vise and just ever so slightly go back the other way, and then it goes on perfectly. Since everything's lining up now, I'm going to start torquing these pickup bolts up to the oil pump. And as I was torquing these, it just didn't feel right. And I kind of like, as I'm looking at this, as I'm torquing this up, the bolts heads were moving, but the actual backside, because I can see it protruding through, wasn't moving. So what that means is that those bolts were twisting and right about to break, even though they weren't at torque. So I just stopped what I was doing. I knew I was gonna have to get new oil pump bolts, so yeah, I just stopped on that. I didn't want to go any further. What I can do, however, is I can pull out that brand new seal I just put in, because my new oil pump gasket is a single piece oil pump gasket. So it's a one-piece oil pump gasket. That means it has the front and rear seals incorporated into it already. So I do not need that brand new seal that I put in. Knowing that I have to replace those oil pump pickup bolts because I don't trust them. As I said, I could see the heads turning, but the actual body wasn't turning where it goes through the oil pump. I am pulling these out, and I am just hoping and praying they do not break off in the oil pump, which fortunately they didn't. Now I'm just going to replace them with regular grade 8 hardware, and I'm going to go to the actual torque spec for, I think it's a 5/16 bolt. I'm not going to go too crazy on it. Alright, so now we can start installing the oil pan. So what I'm doing is I'm just putting a tiny little bit of sealer in the corners of the oil pans. I don't need to put it around the whole thing. I'm just doing a little tiny bit because that area is, there's a bit of a cavity underneath it, and I just want to make sure that there's real good adhesion right in that spot. Now that the oil pan gasket is loosely on the block, I'm just going to clean off the oil pan, and we are going to work on getting that installed. because this is my test engine, we are just going to use the off-the-shelf bolts. We're not going to do anything fancy. Even when I build the next engine, you don't need to do fancy bolts. I just want to. The bolts don't know. They all hold the same strength as long as they're graded the same. But it just looks better with the black ARP hardware, in my opinion, other than these yellow zinc plated grade 8s. Now that I've got all the bolts loosely tightened, I'm going to torque them all down to the correct specs. Alright, with the oil pan on, it is time to do a little bit of shop cleanup. Alright, with the oil pan on, next up is we are going to put these valve covers back on. So again, we are just using off-the-shelf hardware, and we are going to torque it to spec. So we're going to start with the middle bolt here, and I'm torquing it down. I do not remember what I had this set to. It might have been 96 inch-pounds, which I think is like 9 foot-pounds, or I may have had a little bit more, but I ended up breaking that 1/4 inch grade 8 bolt. So you can see here I am undoing all of the bolts on that valve cover, and I am just hoping and praying that it wasn't too deep in the head, and it wasn't. It was broken. I was able to just unscrew it with my finger, and it came right out. I was so happy that that happened. So what I do is I put the bolts back in, and this time I just go with a slightly lower torque. Yeah, I'm not sure why it broke. But it did. So went with the lower torque. They're tight. I'm not too worried about it. If they leave, I'll tighten them up a bit more. Alrighty, so I did a tiny bit of cleanup off camera, and I found a big oopsie that I made while reassembling this engine. And thankfully I was cleaning up as I went along, because I need to pull the oil pan off, I need to pull the oil pump off, and the reason for that is it's sitting on my tray in the bottom left hand corner of your screen. I forgot to reinstall the oil pump drive shaft. So that oil pump drive shaft goes from the top of the pump all the way to the distributor, and as you can see, it's not in the engine. So with that oil pump drive shaft not being in the engine, it means I would not have any oil pressure, which means if I started this up, I would instantly grenade it. So thankfully I caught this while I was cleaning up. It pays to keep a clean shop. You know, had I not cleaned up my teardown cart, I probably would have forgotten about it. So I'm very fortunate. So yeah, I'm going to pull the pan off, I'm going to pull the oil pump off, and then I'm going to put the oil pump drive shaft in. Alright, with the oil pump drive shaft installed, the oil pump reinstalled, I can put the oil pan back on. And as you can see throughout that entire process, the oil pump gasket didn't even move. So I just put the pan right back on, put all the bolts on, and I'm going to retorque them all down like I did previously. All right, so by flipping this engine back over, it is pretty much ready to go back in the car. It is reassembled. I am content with it. I think it'll run just fine. I know I'm probably going to beat the crap out of the number 5 bearing just because of the nature of this build. I didn't have it balanced. I'm putting a different flywheel on it, but the engine's built. So now that the engine is built, I'm going to start putting all of the connectors back onto this engine harness. And stupid me, when I took it all apart, I didn't make a note of which wires go where on each of the connectors. So what I need to do is need to refer to my wiring diagrams. I need to pin it out, and this time I'm going to write it all down. So that's why I've got a Google Drive sheet open. Is as I go through this, I'm going to make note of which pin is in which connector, and yeah. Yeah, so because I was a lazy idiot when I took this all apart, I got to kind of pin it all out and make sure I got the right pins going to the right place. And yeah, just I should have marked it all and written it all down, but it is what it is. Yeah, so what I'm looking at here is the idle air control valve wiring. There's 4 wires that go into there. There's IAC high, IAC low. Anyways, there's 4 wires. I forget exactly what they all are. And I need to make sure they're plugged into the right place. Otherwise, the IAC motor is not going to work correctly. So, you know, just comparing the wiring diagram and, you know, seeing which one. I think it's IAC A high and low, IAC B high and low, if I recall correctly. But in any case, I need to make sure that I'm wiring it all correctly. So referring to the diagrams and the pinouts, and, you know, just making sure that I've got the orientation correct. Otherwise, I'll have all 4 wires kind of reversed. Alright, now that I've got all of the wires that I previously had done reconnected, I'm going to do a little bit of work on the back of the intake while I have it off. So what I have to do is I need to install a stainless fitting that I have for the airline, or for a vacuum line, and that's going to go to both the fuel pressure regulator as well as the surge valve for the Pro Charger. So it's going to be a T on the back of this, but in order for me to install it, I need to remove both the air intake valve, or the intake air temperature sensor, which I just removed, as well as the manifold air pressure sensor, which is the other one that's still on there. Now, before I do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to increase the size of the NPT fitting for the intake air temperature sensor. Now, NPT fittings are tapered, so it starts small and then it gets bigger as you get towards the end of it. So why I'm tapping this out a little bit further is because I want to be able to screw that intake air temperature sensor into the hole a bit more. And so by tapping it out, it will actually make that hole bigger, which allows the entire fitting to install closer to the intake. One of the reasons why I'm doing that is there is just not a whole lot of room behind the intake and between the firewall to get wires on and off. So if I can get that moved in even an eighth of an inch, it's a significant amount in this case. So I'm just using a wrench and I'm just going to use that tap. I don't want to go too aggressive on it though. The reason being is I don't want to split the intake, and if I just keep cranking on it and tapping it, I kind of run that risk. You know, if I really want to do this, what I could do is take a drill bit and drill it out and then tap it, but I do get it a little bit more. I think I get it about an eighth of an inch, and that's all I'm comfortable doing, because as I say, I don't want to crack the intake by, you know, forcing that tap in there. Since I'm installing the intake air temperature for real this time, I'm taking a little bit of Teflon wrap and putting it on the sensor. You don't need a whole ton of this stuff, just, you know, 1 or 2 loops and that's it. And there we go. The intake air temperature sensor is installed. So this right there that I pulled off is the manifold air pressure sensor. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, I need to install a stainless steel T for vacuum. And I need to install that before I install the intake air temperature sensor. So that's the T fitting there, adding a little bit of the Teflon tape to the threads to seal it. Again, you don't need a lot, just a little bit. So put it on, tighten it down, and then after that, I will reinstall the intake air temperature sensor. And last but not least, we can reinstall the MAP sensor. So that's the manifold air pressure sensor. I just threw a tiny little bit of lube on the thread before we put it back on. And now I am checking the hardware for the upper intake. I had a couple of the bolts out already, and what I just noticed is this intake also comes with 5/16 studs. So this also comes with all of the hardware to install the intake down onto the engine, which makes me very happy. So I can install, as you can see, I'm just super pumped about that, because I was just going to use regular bolts, but I no longer have to. I can use the hardware that came with the intake, and that just makes me super happy. So as you can see on the back of this intake, there is still one of those 4 holes empty, and that's going to be for the brake booster. So that's going to be an NPT to -6 AN, I think is what I'm going to end up putting in there. And I will likely have to modify the MAP sensor slightly, and it'll have to go on last, but I'm not too concerned about that. What we're doing here is we are putting the intake back in. We are loosely running wires back through the intake. And the reason being is I need to wire up that MAP sensor still. I never wired it when it was on the car. I didn't have the right connector at the time. I now have the right connector, so we are going to wire that in. Alright, the map sensor is wired in, and now I am just throwing some air through the... those are the fuel rails. The reason being is I just wanted to blow some air through there just to clear out the lines. All the fuel lines, just make sure there's no debris in them. I got it off the engine, so I might as well do it now. It doesn't hurt anything. And then just clean up the floor a little bit. And since we have the wiring harness fixed, the engine put back together, it is time to clean up the shop. Alright, so what I'm doing now is I want to figure out what the firing order is on this engine. Ford has two firing orders that they used. One's called the HO firing order, and one is their non-HO firing order, so I just kind of need to know which one I have. And I knew from before that the number one intake valve is closest to the front of the engine, so I incorrectly assumed that all of the intake valves were the first of the two, but that's actually not correct. On the driver's side, that's 5, 6, 7, 8, the intake valves are actually closer to the back of the engine. So this is why I was having such a difficult time figuring out which intakes were firing, and these events also happen very quick, so once I definitively got 1 and 5, I was able to figure out the firing order. I forget exactly what it is, 1, 5, 4, 2, 6, 3, 7, 8 or something like that. I don't quote me on that, just look it up if you need to do this. But once I look it up, I confirm that I do have the non-HO firing order on this engine. Yeah, there we go. It's 154-26378, and that is the firing order, the non-HO firing order, and the firing order of this engine. Alright, so since I've figured that out, I'm going to start working on my engine leveler. So this is what I bolt to the engine, and then the engine hoist connects to lift the engine up and down. This is a universal hoist, so this has, you know, the flat pieces on the bottom in case your engine lifted, you know, from the valley. Mine does not. I bolt to the front and the back, so I'm cutting all of those little like the bottom of the L bracket off of all of them. That way I can just bolt to the front and the back. And then I am also going to shorten the chains. They are just way too long for what I need, so I'm going to shorten them down. So with all those shortened down, I'm just going to throw the leveler back on the engine, and I'm going to get ready to lift this engine and put it in the car. Well, not put it in the car, just get it off the stand, but you'll see why I'm only pulling it off the stand in later videos. So some of these bolts don't thread in quite as nice as I would like. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull out my tap and die set, and I'm going to clean up all of the threads in these heads, just because these heads are used. So yeah, I'm just going to clean up all the threads just to make them real nice. And with getting the leveler on the engine, that is all the time we have for this video. So as always, if you have stuck around this long, I'd like to thank you for viewing, and we'll see you in the next one.